Well, Canada has been focusing on growing national defense with recent conversations surrounding the prospect of upgrading the military fleet, the air fleet, with a mix of F-35s and Saab Gripen jets. Now, here to discuss the economic implications of having this mixed fleet is Richard Shimooka, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And Richard, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's get your initial thoughts on the idea. Do you like seeing a mixed fleet? Is it something you feel can work?
Probably not. I think there's been multiple analyses done internally, externally from Department of National Defense that have shown that a mixed fleet is basically unworkable. One of the current problems that the Canadian forces have is that they have a limited number of pilots, and a transition towards a mixed fleet would severely strain what few pilots that the forces have, because when you think about actually putting together a mixed fleet, you require what's called a pipeline of pilots, which is a sort of a training system, sort of the sustainment side, and that really is a difficult proposition because you actually have a large number of people that are they're actually not operational, they're just in the training pipeline they're sort of getting ready to fly, and the development and building of that really takes up a lot of the sort of resources. And even though that we're seeing a significant increase in the defense spending by the government, there's just not enough sort of resources that are available to actually undertake that. So that's a major concern. The second part is the capability side, which is as much as there's been sort of talk that, well, the Gripen may just be maybe better for Arctic or sort of other sort of capabilities, the reality is that it's basically a generation earlier. And while some of our allies do have what's called a mixed fleet of two different aircraft, the reality is that that they made that decision decades ago, and they're just they have a legacy fleet of old aircraft. And we're trying to make a choice here where we're going to try to employ an aircraft that is basically 20-some years old, even though we already have the next generation of fighters that we're currently using. So overall, it doesn't really make much sense, and I think that it's really been driven by sort of the political factors that are at play with the United States.
Hi, Richard. It's Paul Harris. So I think people who are supporting the Saab kind of thing is that they think there's a lot more jobs coming to Canada. Do you have any thoughts about that, or is that something that just is not something that you would consider?
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, the way that Saab is trying to portray its job options is through what's called licensed production, and they currently utilize that with Brazil. And Brazil really only just does the final assembly of the aircraft, and it's called what are called knockdown kits, which are just sort of large portions of the final sub-assemblies that they sort of put together in country. And it only gets around 300-some jobs. Now, Saab is claiming, well, we're going to get you 12,000 jobs or 10,000 jobs based on sort of different reporting. The reality is that a lot of that is illusory. Even the whole Saab Gripen enterprise is probably around 6,000 jobs overall. So unless Canada really just wants to spend far more on this aircraft than even its current cost, which is probably around maybe around 100 million or 85 million, somewhere in there, which is more than the F-35, I should point out. The reality is that you're not going to see the sort of the job growth as what's being claimed.
Now, with that in mind, what about the F-35? How many jobs would that bring to Canada? Or will it bring any jobs other than the pilots who are flying it? But would that bring any more jobs? Which is the better one? Which one's touting the more jobs, I guess?
Well, Canada, because of the nature of the F-35 program, already has a significant footprint within the country, and that's largely because back around 1998 and then in 2006, we joined a partnership agreement that basically made Canada a sort of a licensed production center for components for the F-35. The key, for example, a company like Haru DevTech in Quebec or Magellan Air Systems, they've been producing parts for the aircraft since around 2009, 2010. So there's been a constant sort of flow of contracts, which I believe it's around $3 billion has already been sort of produced out of Canada. And almost every single F-35 has Canadian parts in it. So the reality is that there's already been a footprint in the country. It's more kind of like a supply chain model that you would see with cars or with sort of any sort of modern good. So the reality is there's already that kind of production. Now, Lockheed has stated, and some of the subcomponent suppliers have stated, that there is additional options where Canada could do sustainment activities like with L3 in Quebec. that would increase because the way that the sort of sustainment enterprise works, you can kind of do work for other countries in Canada, like the United States, and there's suggestions there's several thousand more jobs that are available if Canada was to go with a full purchase.
So, Richard, it's Paul Harris again. So, I mean, one of the issues with these mixed things, I mean, I don't think the government's had a very good job at procurement. And we constantly hear about this stuff. It just makes it sound like they're going to have an even more difficult time having two different aircrafts, and the procurement issues are going to be much more difficult. Do you think that, what do you think about that?
That's basically the reality. In 2014, Department of Defense did an analysis of this exact fleet model, and it stated basically what you said, is that there's going to be difficulties in procurement. I think that the idea that we would kind of bring a lot of the jobs to Canada, it may be possible, but the reality is that after the production is over, Saab was suggesting that they would do around 70 aircraft in Canada. There would be no follow-through. There's no follow-on program behind that, and you would just you'd build up the facilities to assemble these aircraft, and then basically build the 70 aircraft and then shut it down. And that's really not the sustainable industry that I believe the government really wants to look at. Whereas, as I said before with the F-35, you've already seen several thousand jobs be in Canada for over a decade and a half here. And it will probably continue for at least another 15 years as the F-35 program kind of goes through its huge order book, right? So it's not really an effective, sustainable way to develop an industry, whereas that was kind of the intent behind the F-35 program and the partnership program that was built several decades ago.
And just one last question. Would the pilots be able to fly both, or would it be strictly one flies one and another one flies the other?
You'd have to have separate pipelines, so there would be no cross availability. They're generationally different as well. They don't operate the same way whatsoever. So there'd be absolutely no ability to use one to have a pilot to do both, or even what would be actually more important would be the maintainers, the people who ensure that they turn the wrenches or whatnot. There'd be no commonality between the two aircraft.
So we'd have to have essentially double of everything to maintain it and fly them.
It'd actually be more than that, just because there's a an overhead number that you're just never going to get around, right? As you scale up a fleet, you can that overhead doesn't really change as much. So the reality is that if you have two small fleets, then it's not going to be it'll be completely inefficient for both of them.
Okay, we have to leave it there, but Richard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Richard Shimooka is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.